The braid was still there. Maria Lockhart stood at the threshold of her front door, one hand pressed flat against the weathered wood frame, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She had not expected it. She had not expected him. After everything that had happened between them, after the betrayal she had witnessed with her own two eyes, after she had told him in no uncertain terms to take his dark past and his gentle hands and his impossible kindness, and ride as far from Redemption Creek, New Mexico, as his horse could carry him, she had not expected to walk outside on a cold November morning in 1882 and find this. Her horse, Copper, stood tied to the post at the edge of the yard just as always, but Copper's dark mane, usually tangled and wild from nights in the open paddock, had been braided, carefully, intricately, 3 thick plaits running from poll to withers, each one woven with a thin strip of red cotton cloth that fluttered in the dry desert wind. Maria's hand tightened on the door frame. She knew only one man who braided horses' manes that way. She had watched him do it once before, in the golden early light of an October morning when he had not known she was watching, his large, capable hands working through Copper's hair with extraordinary gentleness, as if the act itself was a kind of prayer. She had stood very still in the shadow of the barn doorway and felt something crack open inside her chest that she had not been able to close again since. But that was before she found the letter. Before she understood what Gilbert Finley had been hiding from her. Before she understood why the most gentle, most careful man she had ever encountered in her 27 years of living in this hard and beautiful country had nonetheless arrived in Redemption Creek carrying a secret that could destroy everything she had spent the last 4 years building. Before she understood that his dark past was not simply his own. It was tangled up in her father's murder. And now the braid was there, red cotton fluttering against Copper's dark neck, and somewhere out on that flat desert road that wound away from her property toward the town of Redemption Creek, Gilbert Finley was either riding away from her forever or riding back. She pressed her palm harder against the wood and felt the splinters bite into her skin. She needed to decide how she felt about that before she found out which one it was. 4 months earlier, in the last blazing heat of a New Mexico summer, Maria Lockhart had not been looking for any complications. She had not been looking for anything at all except perhaps a fair price on the additional pasture land east of her property, and a roof that did not leak when the monsoons came. She had been running the Lockhart homestead alone for 4 years, since her father Thomas Lockhart had been shot dead on the road between Redemption Creek and Santa Fe, and she had grown accustomed to the particular flavor of solitude that came with hard work and purposeful grief. She did not entertain visitors. She did not go to town dances. She nodded at her neighbors when she passed them on the road, and she kept her father's old Winchester rifle loaded and leaning against the wall beside her front door, and she considered that an adequate arrangement for the life she had made. And then one afternoon in late July, a stranger rode up her drive on a dust-colored horse and asked, very politely and with his hat already in his hand, if she might be willing to sell water rights to the creek that crossed the southern edge of her property. His name was Gilbert Finley. He was 29 years old. He had dark hair that wanted cutting and steady brown eyes, and a way of standing very still when he spoke to you, as though he considered his words carefully before releasing them into the world. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip with the easy familiarity of a man who had grown up with firearms, but he handled it the way some men handled tools, practically and without drama, and Maria noticed that the leather on his holster was plain and unornamented, with none of the silver-studded flashiness that she associated with men who wanted you to be afraid of them. She told him no on the water rights. She told him she could not afford to sell anything attached to her land because her land was all she had, and she intended to hold on to it. He nodded and thanked her and rode back down the drive, and she watched him go with her arms crossed over her chest and told herself she felt nothing. But the next week He came back and offered to repair the eastern fence line in exchange for the right to water his horses at the creek for the duration of the summer. Maria had been meaning to repair that fence line for 3 months and had not had the time or the spare lumber to manage it, and she was a practical woman above all other things. She accepted. He spent 4 days on that fence, working from first light to last, and she brought him water twice a day because it was 104 degrees in the shade, and she was not a person who let other people suffer from preventable misery regardless of her feelings about complications. On the 4th day he finished the fence and came to find her at the barn where she was mending a bridle, and he took off his hat and thanked her for the water and said he hoped the fence would hold through the winter. She said she expected it would since he had used the good timber she had in the back of the barn. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it arrived on his face slowly, like light coming over a mesa, and it changed him entirely. She looked away quickly and focused on the bridle. He said he had noticed the roof on the small storage shed near the paddock had a section of damaged shingles, and if she had the materials he would be glad to fix it before he moved on, considering she had been so generous with the water. She told him she was not helpless. He said he could see that clearly, and that he was not offering out of any belief that she could not manage it herself. He was offering because he had the time and the skill, and he would like to do it. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not flinch under her gaze, which she appreciated. Most men either looked away or puffed themselves up when she looked at them directly. He simply looked back at her, calm and even and entirely sincere. She told him the shingles were in the same shed and showed him where to find them. His name was Gilbert Finley, and he had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 months before she met him. He told her one evening as she brought him the end-of-day coffee that had somehow become a habit neither of them had explicitly planned. He had come from Colorado, from a town called Black Creek up in the mountains, and he had come south looking for land of his own. He had some savings, enough to establish a small spread if he was careful. He liked the high desert. He liked the light. Maria asked him what he had done in Black Creek. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had worked various jobs, fencing, some ranch work. He had been a deputy for a time. He left it at that, and something in his stillness told her there was more he was not saying. But she did not press him because she understood the right to keep your own counsel better than most people, and she respected it even when it made her curious. Over the following weeks, Gilbert Finley became a reliable presence on the edges of Maria Lockhart's carefully ordered life. He would ride out from the rooms he rented above the hardware store in Redemption Creek 2 or 3 mornings a week, and find work to do on her property that genuinely needed doing, and she would feed him lunch in exchange, and they would drink coffee in the evenings on her front porch while the sky turned every color between gold and purple, and the coyotes started up in the arroyos. They talked. Slowly at first, carefully, the way 2 people talk when they have both learned to be cautious with their words. But as the summer softened into the long, dry beauty of a New Mexico September, something between them began to shift and warm. She told him about her father, about how Thomas Lockhart had come west from Missouri in 1861 with $40 and a wagon and had built this homestead out of pure stubborn love for this land. She told him how her mother had died of fever when Maria was 11, and how her father had raised her to ride and shoot and mend fences and keep her own accounts, and how she had loved him without reservation for all 27 years of her life, and had never entirely accepted his absence from it. Gilbert listened to all of it with the quality of attention that she was learning was particular to him, as if whatever she said was the most important thing that had been said in the entire territory that day. He told her about his own people. His father had been a blacksmith in Ohio. His mother had been a quiet woman who read every book she could obtain and had insisted her children do the same. He had 2 brothers, both still in Ohio, both thoroughly settled and domesticated and baffled by their youngest sibling's persistent inability to stay in one place. She asked him why he had not stayed in one place. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, sometimes a man makes choices that make it difficult to look at familiar places without seeing what he has done in them. She understood that more than she expected to. September became October, and the nights turned cold, and Maria Lockhart made a decision that she recognized even at the time as dangerous. She made it with open eyes, which she considered the only responsible way to make dangerous decisions. She invited Gilbert Finley to eat supper at her table 3 evenings a week, and on the first evening he arrived at her door with his hat in his hand, and a jar of honey he had bought from the woman at the mercantile who kept bees on the edge of town, because he had heard Maria say once in passing that she had run out and could not get to town before the following week. She set the honey on the table and looked at it, and felt that cracking sensation in her chest again. He was the most careful man she had ever met. Not careful in a cowardly sense, not cautious in the way of men who feared consequences. Careful in the sense of attentive, careful in the sense of noticing. He noticed everything about her, all the small peripheral things that people usually missed. That she always turned her coffee cup so the handle faced left, that she went quiet when the wind picked up because it reminded her of something she would not name, that she was left-handed with a pencil but right-handed with a rifle, that she laughed precisely 3 times in a normal evening, and each time it surprised her as if she had forgotten she knew how. He noticed, and he remembered, and he acted on what he remembered in the quiet, undemonstrative way of a man who believed that care was better shown than announced. And Maria Lockhart, who had spent 4 years being entirely self-sufficient and entirely alone, found that she was in serious trouble. She was falling in love with Gilbert Finley. She handled this the way she handled most things that frightened her, by ignoring it and continuing to function. She told herself it was proximity and loneliness. She told herself it would pass. She watched him one morning from the barn doorway as he braided Copper's mane in the early gold light, his hands gentle and precise, and she felt the full weight of what was happening to her settle into her bones like something permanent. And she turned and walked to the far end of the barn and stood in the dark for 5 minutes pressing her forehead against Copper's old saddle hanging on the wall. Then she walked back out and asked him what he wanted for breakfast. October deepened, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow and began to let go of their leaves, and Gilbert Finley asked Maria Lockhart if he might court her properly. He asked her on a Tuesday evening sitting on her front porch while the last light was leaving the sky. He said it plainly and directly, looking at her with those steady brown eyes, and he said he understood if she would rather not complicate what had become an arrangement that worked well for both of them, and he would respect her answer either way, but he felt he owed her his honesty. Maria looked at the darkening desert for a long time. Then she said she supposed that would be acceptable. He smiled that slow Masolite smile and said nothing else, and somehow that was exactly right. What followed were the 3 finest weeks of Maria Lockhart's adult life, though she would not admit this out loud to anyone, and barely admitted it to herself in the deepest privacy of her own thoughts at 3 in the morning, when the cold stars were blazing through her window. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons along the high ridge that looked out over the whole valley. He brought her books from the small lending library that had recently been established in the back of the Redemption Creek General Store. He held her hand walking back from the church social that she attended for the first time in 2 years, because he had asked her if she might like to go, and the straightforward, unremarkable warmth of his hand around hers was somehow the most disarming thing that had ever happened to her. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late October, standing on her porch in the cold air with the moon enormous above the desert. It was unhurried and honest, and nothing at all like the aggressive performances she had experienced from other men who had tried to impress her over the years. It was simply him, being as careful with her as he was with everything else, and she kissed him back with her hands flat against his chest, and felt entirely certain and entirely terrified in equal measure. Afterward he said good night and rode back to town, and she stood on the porch for a long time looking at the road and then looked at Copper at the post, and felt herself smiling so broadly in the dark that it almost embarrassed her. She was still smiling the following morning when she went to look for the deed to the eastern pasture land, which she needed for the county assessor's visit the following week. She kept her important papers in her father's old cedar chest in the bedroom, the one he had brought from Missouri in 1861. She opened it and began looking through the folders inside, and she found what she was looking for, and she was replacing everything when her hand touched a folded paper that was not in any folder and had not been there the last time she had opened the chest, which had been 2 weeks ago at most. She unfolded it. It was a letter, written in a compact, careful hand that she did not recognize, addressed to no one, signed with no name. She read it once. Then she sat down on the floor beside the cedar chest and read it again slowly as the morning light moved across the floorboards. The letter said, "I know where the Lockhart woman lives. I know what Finley knows about Lockhart's death. If he has told her anything, she is already a danger to us. Handle it. Remember what we discussed in Black Creek. Finley owes us a debt, and he knows the cost of forgetting it." Maria sat on the floor for a very long time. Gilbert Finley knew something about her father's death. Thomas Lockhart had been found shot on the road between Redemption Creek and Santa Fe on a morning in the spring of 1878. The sheriff at the time, a man named Prout who had since died of pneumonia, had ruled it a robbery gone wrong, and Maria had accepted this because she had been given nothing else to accept. There had been no suspects found, no trial, no justice of any kind. She had buried her father and taken over the homestead and told herself that in the West, death was often like this, abrupt and unexplained and permanent. But here was a letter, hidden in her father's chest by someone who had been inside her home, suggesting that her father's death had not been random at all, suggesting it had been deliberate, suggesting that Gilbert Finley, the man she had just kissed on her front porch under the enormous October moon, knew something about it and had not told her. She thought about the things he had said and not said, about the careful silences, about Black Creek, Colorado, about choices that made it difficult to look at familiar places. She got up from the floor. She went to the front door. She took down her father's Winchester from the wall and checked that it was loaded and then stood for a moment with it in her hands. Then she put it back. She was not going to do anything rash. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she acted, because acting in ignorance was how people made catastrophic mistakes, and Maria Lockhart did not make catastrophic mistakes if she could help it. She needed to find out who had put that letter in her chest. She needed to find out what Gilbert Finley knew and why he had hidden it. And she needed to do both of those things without letting whoever had written the letter know she had found it. She folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her skirt and went to saddle Copper and ride to town. The thing about Redemption Creek in 1882 was that it was not an especially rough town by New Mexico Territory standards. It had a proper sheriff, a man named Earl Dawson who had held the position for 6 years and was considered competent and reasonably honest. It had a school, a church, a doctor, a telegraph office, and a newspaper that came out twice weekly. It also had, like every town in the territory, its share of men who operated in the gray spaces between the law and the absence of it. Maria went to see Sheriff Dawson first. She told him she had reason to believe her father's death had not been accidental, and showed him the letter. Dawson read it with a carefully expressionless face, and told her it was a serious matter, and he would look into it. And she could see from his expression that he recognized something in what he was reading, though he said nothing specific. She left his office feeling that she knew slightly more than she had before, and could trust only slightly more than she had before, which in her experience was about the normal rate of information acquisition in the territory. Then she went to the hardware store and asked old Mr. Briggs, whose rooms were above the store as Gilbert Finley's were, whether Finley had any recent visitors. Briggs, who was a constitutionally observant man and also somewhat lonely and therefore enthusiastically willing to share what he knew, told her that a man had come to see Finley 2 days ago. A big man, light-haired, with a scar on his jaw. He had not looked like a social caller. Maria recognized the description from the stories she had heard over the years about a man named Cord Darby, who ran a protection operation across 3 counties and was widely suspected of numerous violent crimes, including at least 2 murders, none of which had ever resulted in a conviction, because witnesses in Cord Darby's cases had a troubling tendency towards sudden memory failure. Cord Darby operated out of Black Creek, Colorado. She rode home from town with the letter in her pocket and the name Cord Darby circling in her head. That evening, Gilbert came for supper as he usually did on Thursdays, and she cooked the meal and set the table and talked with him about ordinary things, the weather turning colder, the cattle she was thinking of selling in the spring, the book she had borrowed from the lending library which turned out to be better than she had expected. He was warm and present and attentive, exactly as always, and she watched him across the table and felt grief and anger and something that was almost worse than either of those. The specific anguish of not being able to stop caring about someone even when you had excellent reasons to. After supper she told him she had found something in her father's chest, and she showed him the letter. She watched his face. She saw it immediately. The flash of something across his expression that was unmistakably recognition, followed immediately by something that looked like dread. He read the letter and set it on the table between them and was quiet for a very long moment. She said quietly and precisely that she needed him to tell her everything, and he did. He told her all of it, and it was worse than she had imagined and better than she had feared, and it ruined everything and explained everything in the same brutal breath. He had known Cord Darby in Black Creek. Not by choice, he said, but by the particular geography of fate that placed a young deputy sheriff in a town where a man like Darby was the primary source of economic influence and therefore political power. Darby had approached him 3 years ago with what he called an arrangement, which meant that Gilbert was expected to look the other way on certain shipments moving through the county, and in return would be protected from the violence that Darby's associates periodically visited on people who were not protected. Gilbert had said no. He had said it plainly and without negotiation, the way Maria now knew was his nature, and Darby had said that was his choice to make. 2 weeks later, Thomas Lockhart was shot dead on the road to Santa Fe. Maria went very still. Gilbert said Thomas Lockhart had come through Black Creek on a business trip and had witnessed something he should not have witnessed, one of Darby's freight operations moving through in the night. Darby had ordered him killed to prevent him from reporting what he had seen. Gilbert had found out afterward, from another deputy who knew and was terrified, and he had tried to bring it to the county sheriff, and had been dismissed and warned and ultimately run out of Black Creek when it became clear that Darby had friends in every office that mattered. He had come to New Mexico looking for a way to build enough of a case against Darby to take to federal authorities, the only authorities far enough outside Darby's reach to be trusted. He had come specifically to Redemption Creek because he knew this was where Thomas Lockhart's family lived, and he had wanted to find a way to help, to do something that mattered for the man whose death he had not been able to prevent. He had not expected Maria to be who she was. He had not expected to fall in love with her. He had been trying to find the right time and the right words to tell her what he knew, and he had been afraid that telling her would destroy the only thing in his life that had felt right in years. Maria listened to all of this without moving. When he was finished, she said 2 things. She said, "You should have told me from the beginning." She said, "You need to leave now." He left. He did not argue or make excuses or ask for clemency, because he was, underneath everything, exactly the man she had thought he was, which was the most infuriating and heartbreaking fact of the entire situation. And now 3 weeks had passed and the Braid was in Copper's, Maine. Maria stood at the threshold of her front door in the early November cold and looked at those red cotton ribbons and tried to decide what she felt. She was still angry. The anger had not diminished. If anything, it had hardened into something precise and specific in the 3 weeks since she had watched him ride away down her drive. She was angry that he had come to her under a pretense, even a well-intentioned one. She was angry that he had let her fall in love with him while keeping a secret of this magnitude. She was angry at herself for having fallen so thoroughly, so disastrously, so completely in love with him anyway. But she was also afraid. Because whoever had put that letter in her father's chest had been inside her home, and if Cord Darby was in Redemption Creek or sending people to Redemption Creek, then her situation was considerably more dangerous than it had been a month ago. And she was also, underneath the anger and the fear and the grief and the pride, desperately glad that he was still here, that he had not simply ridden away the way she had told him to, that he had come in the night and braided her horse's mane with red cotton ribbons so that she would know, without words and without the complication of his presence, that he had not gone. She put on her boots and her coat and walked down to Copper. Up close the braid was even more careful than she had seen from the doorway. 3 perfect plaits, evenly spaced, each ribbon tied off at the end with a small neat knot. She ran her fingers along one of them and thought about his hands doing this in the dark, quietly, with nobody watching, with no expectation of thanks. She pressed her forehead against Copper's warm neck and closed her eyes. She had to think about what came next. What came next arrived faster than she had planned for, because 2 hours later, while she was in the barn brushing Copper and trying to organize her thoughts into something actionable, Sheriff Dawson rode up to her property with a young deputy and a tight expression, and told her that Cord Darby had been spotted in Redemption Creek the day before yesterday. He said it with the gravity of a man who had been doing some thinking of his own since she had shown him the letter. He said that he had sent a wire to the federal marshal's office in Albuquerque and that an agent would arrive within the week, but that in the meantime she should not be alone on this property and she should not go into town if she could avoid it. Maria asked if he had spoken to Gilbert Finley. Dawson's expression shifted slightly. He said he had. He said Finley had come to see him 3 days ago and had provided a full account of what he knew about Darby's operation in Black Creek, including names and dates and the details of Thomas Lockhart's death. Dawson said it was the most comprehensive account of criminal activity he had received in 6 years of wearing the star. Maria stared at him. Dawson said Finley had also told him something else. He said that Darby's man had come to warn Finley to leave the territory and keep his mouth shut, and Finley had sent the man back with a message for Darby that was not a compliance and was not a negotiation. He had, in other words, made himself a target. Maria felt a cold clenching in her chest. She asked where Gilbert Finley was right now. Dawson said he was at the Redemption Creek Hotel, where Dawson had installed his deputy to keep watch, and that was where he would stay until the federal agent arrived. Maria thanked the sheriff and watched him ride away, and then stood in her barn with her hand on Copper's neck, thinking about a man sitting in a hotel room in town, having made himself a target for a man like Cord Darby, because he had decided that doing the right thing was more important than his own safety. Because he had decided that Thomas Lockhart deserved better than to be a name on a list of unsolved murders. She saddled Copper. She rode to Redemption Creek. She left Copper at the livery and walked up the main street of town toward the hotel, passing the mercantile and the blacksmith and the barbershop with its striped pole, and the little schoolhouse at the end of the street, where she could hear children reciting something she could not make out. Redemption Creek in November was a quiet town. The sky was that particular deep blue of the high desert in autumn, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold, and something faintly piney from the mountains to the north. The deputy sitting in the lobby of the hotel stood up when she came in, and she told him her name and said she was there to see Gilbert Finley, and he looked uncertain and then sat back down, which she interpreted as permission. She went up the stairs and knocked on the door at the end of the hall. There was a silence, and then his voice, careful and controlled. "Who is it?" She said her name. There was a longer silence. Then the door opened. He looked exactly as she remembered and simultaneously like someone who had not slept well in 3 weeks, which, she allowed herself to acknowledge, was not a state she was entirely unfamiliar with herself. He was in shirt sleeves, his revolver on the table behind him within easy reach. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said nothing, just waited, which was entirely characteristic of him. She walked past him into the room and turned around and said she had 2 things to say. He said he was listening. She said first, she was still angry with him and she expected him to understand why, and she expected him to acknowledge without reservation or excuse that he should have told her the truth from the beginning. He said yes. He said she was right. He said there was no justification that would make that acceptable and he was not going to offer one. He said he was sorry in a way that was so plainly and completely without performance that it entered her like something physical. She took a breath. She said second, she knew he had braided Copper's mane. He was quiet. His expression changed in that slow way of his, something complex and careful moving behind his eyes. She said she was not asking him to explain it. She understood why he had done it. She understood all of it better than she wished she did. He said, very quietly, that he had not been willing to leave without letting her know he was still here. That if she wanted him gone, she could tell him and he would go, but he could not make himself disappear without a word, as if none of it had happened, as if she had not mattered. He said she had mattered more than he had any right to expect anything to matter, and he was sorry for all of it, but he could not be sorry for that. Maria looked at him across the small hotel room. She said she was not telling him to go. The thing that crossed his face then was not relief exactly, or happiness exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who has been standing very tensely for a very long time and has just been given permission to breathe. She told him about Dawson's visit and what the sheriff had said about the federal agent coming and the need to be careful until then. She told him she had her father's Winchester and she knew how to use it, and she was not going to hide in her house and wait for other people to determine her fate, but she was also not going to do anything foolish. He said he would not ask her to hide. She said she knew. They sat down in the 2 chairs beside the window and talked for 2 hours about everything that needed to be talked about, the parts of the truth that had been hidden, and the reasons they had been hidden, and the space between what was justified and what was merely understandable. It was the hardest conversation Maria had had in 4 years, harder in its way than the conversation with the sheriff who had told her her father was dead, because this one required her to be simultaneously present and unguarded and angry and fair, which was an exhausting combination. But at the end of it, she understood something she had not quite understood before, or perhaps had understood intellectually, but not in the full weight of her heart. That Gilbert Finley had arrived in Redemption Creek carrying guilt that was not entirely his own, guilt about a death he had tried to prevent and failed to prevent, and that his care for her had been real from the beginning, genuine and unglamored and entirely without agenda, except the agenda of love, which was the most complicated and most honest agenda there was. She did not tell him she forgave him. It was too soon for that, and she was a woman who did not say things she did not completely mean. But she told him she was willing to work toward it, and that was the truth. He said that was more than enough. The federal agent arrived 4 days later, a man named Harlan Cruz who came up from Albuquerque on the train and who was, in Maria's assessment upon meeting him, the most thorough and quietly competent government official she had ever encountered. He met with Sheriff Dawson and with Gilbert and with Maria herself, taking careful notes in a narrow leather journal. And what emerged from those meetings was a picture of Cord Darby's operation across 3 counties in Colorado and 2 in New Mexico that was considerably more extensive than anyone had fully appreciated. Cruz said he had been building a case against Darby for 18 months. He said Gilbert's testimony, combined with the names and dates he had provided to Dawson, was the most significant piece of evidence he had yet obtained. He said he expected to be able to move against Darby within a matter of weeks. Maria asked what happened to people who were witnesses in cases like this before the move was made. Cruz looked at her steadily and said that was a reasonable concern and that he was taking steps to address it. He had 3 additional marshals coming in from Santa Fe by the end of the week, and he intended to establish a visible presence in Redemption Creek that would make any action against witnesses extremely inadvisable. Over the following week, the town of Redemption Creek acquired an unusual density of calm, well-armed federal men, and the atmosphere shifted into the particular quality of stillness that precedes either a storm or a resolution. Maria went about her daily work on the homestead and spent her evenings at the hotel with Gilbert, the 2 of them sitting by the fire in the small lobby, and talking with the careful thoroughness of people who were building something they had not originally had adequate foundation for. They talked about her father. She told him things she had not told anyone, the private grief of the years since his death, the peculiar guilt of being alive and functional while someone you loved was simply gone. Gilbert listened with the quality of attention she had come to think of as specifically his, and occasionally he said things that were not comforting in a general sense but were precise and true, which was more useful than comfort. She told him she thought he had come to Redemption Creek partly out of guilt, and she wanted to know if that was all it was, whether his involvement with her had been fundamentally motivated by his need to resolve something within himself rather than by genuine feeling for her. He said he had asked himself the same question many times. He said he had come to Redemption Creek because of guilt. He had stayed in Redemption Creek because of her. He said the distinction mattered to him and he hoped it mattered to her. She said it did. And it did. On a Thursday evening, 12 days after the federal agent's arrival, Cord Darby made his move. He came in the night, as men like him always did. 3 riders, fast and quiet, converging on the hotel from different directions. What he had not accounted for was that one of Cruz's deputies had been watching the road out of town for 3 days and had ridden in ahead of them. And so, when Darby's men arrived at the hotel, they found not a vulnerable witness in a second-floor room but 4 federal marshals with Winchester rifles at the ready. Maria was at the hotel that night. She was there because she had been having supper with Gilbert and Cruz when the deputy rode in with the warning, and Cruz had looked at her with the brief expression of a man calculating the fastest way to manage a complex situation, and had said simply that she should stay inside and away from the windows. She did, but she also took up a position near the back window with her father's Winchester, because she was not a person who sat quietly while other people managed her fate, and she had already decided that if anyone came through the back of that building, they were going to find out why Thomas Lockhart had raised his daughter to shoot straight. Nobody came through the back of the building. The confrontation at the front lasted less than 10 minutes and ended without a shot fired, because Cord Darby, facing 4 federal marshals who had been expecting him, made the calculation that men who have survived as long as he had make when the arithmetic stops working in their favor. He surrendered, along with his 2 men, and was taken into federal custody before midnight on a Thursday in November in the town of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory. Maria stood at the back window with the Winchester and listened to the sounds of the situation resolving, and when Gilbert appeared in the doorway and said it was over, she set the rifle down carefully and sat down in the nearest chair, and felt 4 years of something she had not had a name for drain out of her like water from a broken vessel. She had not known she was still carrying it. The specific waiting grief of an unavenged death, the knowledge that her father had been murdered, and the world had simply continued without acknowledgement. She had not known how much weight that was until it was no longer there. Gilbert came and sat beside her and did not say anything, which was exactly right. After a while she said she wanted to go home. He rode with her, the 2 of them on the night road between town and the homestead, the cold stars overhead and the desert on either side deep and silent and smelling of sage and cold earth. Copper's braided mane had grown out somewhat over the 3 weeks since he had braided it, 2 of the plaits loose and tangled, but the third still holding its shape. At her door he stopped, and she dismounted and stood for a moment with the reins in her hands, looking at him on his dust-colored horse, and she thought about everything they had been through in 4 months, and about the particular nature of people who were, when stripped of all their defenses and contradictions, exactly what they appeared to be. She said, "Come inside." He did. They sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and she said she wanted to say something that she had been working towards saying for a while now, and she was going to say it plainly because plainness was the mode she was most comfortable with. He said he was listening. She said she loved him. She said she had known it for certain on the morning she had watched him braid her horse's mane, and felt it settle into her bones like something permanent, and that everything that had happened since had been extremely inconvenient and painful, but had not changed that central fact, and she was done working around it. Gilbert Finley looked at her across her kitchen table in the lamplight, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not performed, but entirely open, as if something that had been carefully held in reserve for a very long time had been released all at once. He said he had been in love with her since the 3rd day of working on her fence, when she had brought him water in the afternoon heat, and told him, without any social softening whatsoever, that he had been doing the post spacing wrong and here was how she preferred it done. She laughed. The surprised, genuine laugh that she knew arrived on her face at most 3 times in an evening. He smiled that slow Masolite smile, and she felt entirely right inside her own life for the first time in 4 years. That November became the beginning of something that Maria Lockhart had not been prepared for, and turned out to want with a thoroughness that astonished her. Gilbert stayed in Redemption Creek. He found a small parcel of land a mile east of the homestead, a modest 20 acres with a creek cutting through the southern edge, and a view of the mountains that was, he told her, the best he had seen since coming to the territory. He bought it with his savings and began building on it in December, working steadily through the cold and the occasional snow, and she rode over most mornings and helped him and brought food and argued with him about the placement of windows and where to put the fireplace. She enjoyed the arguing. He was not a man who backed down from a position without good reason, which she respected enormously, but he was also genuinely willing to be persuaded when she made a better argument, which she respected even more. Her relationship with the land changed that winter. She had been holding the homestead as a kind of memorial, she realized, a place preserved exactly as her father had left it, and letting herself love it as something alive rather than sacred was a process that Gilbert's presence somehow facilitated. Not because he pushed her to change anything, but because watching him build something from nothing on his 20 acres reminded her that the land was for living on and not just for guarding. She brought him her father's tools from the barn, the good ones, the ones Thomas Lockhart had used to build the homestead fence by fence and beam by beam, and she told him she would like him to use them. He took them with both hands and looked at her and said something quiet about what it meant to her to offer that, and she said he did not need to say anything about it, and he nodded, and that was that. Christmas came with a cold snap that frosted the desert into something strange and beautiful. The cottonwoods were bare, their white branches stark against a sky the color of pewter. Maria cooked a proper Christmas dinner for the first time since her father died, and invited not just Gilbert but also old Mrs. Perez from the neighboring property, who was 73 and widowed, and had brought Maria squash from her garden every September for 4 years without ever asking for anything in return. And the young schoolteacher, a woman named Alice Bright, who had arrived in town the previous spring from Ohio, and whom Maria had decided she liked, despite having told herself she was not in the market for new friendships. It was a very good Christmas dinner. Gilbert fixed the stovepipe that had been drawing badly for months while Maria was making pies, and Mrs. Perez brought postle that was the best thing Maria had eaten in years, and Alice Bright turned out to have a genuinely good singing voice and led them all through 3 carols after supper, even getting Gilbert, who claimed he could not sing, to join in on the third. Maria sat at her table, surrounded by people she loved, and looked at the lamplight on the walls of the house her father had built and felt something settle in her heart that had long been unsettled. In February of 1883, Cord Darby was tried in a federal court in Santa Fe. Gilbert testified for 3 days. Maria came with him and sat in the gallery, and she listened to him speak with the same quality of precision and honesty with which he did everything, laying out the facts in plain order without dramatics, and she watched the jury watch him and knew from their faces that they believed him, because it was impossible not to believe a man who spoke without seeking anything for himself. Darby was convicted on 4 counts, including the murder of Thomas Lockhart and 2 additional murders in Colorado that the federal investigation had uncovered. He was sentenced to hang. Maria sat in the gallery when the sentence was read and was very still for a very long time, and then she took a long breath and let it out slowly, and felt her father somewhere in that breath, not gone, but resolved. That evening she and Gilbert ate supper in a Santa Fe restaurant that had tablecloths and candles, and a menu she had to read carefully, because some of the items were things she had never encountered. Gilbert watched her read the menu with visible affection, and she told him not to smile at her like that, and he smiled harder, and she kicked him lightly under the table, and the man at the next table looked at them with the expression of someone watching 2 people who were helplessly in love with each other, which was not inaccurate. They walked back to the hotel through the Santa Fe streets after supper, the night cold and the stars immense overhead, and at the hotel door Gilbert stopped and looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize as the expression he wore when he was preparing to say something that mattered. He said he had been meaning to ask her something for a while now, and he had been waiting for the right moment, and he was not certain this was the right moment, but he was going to ask anyway because he had learned from her that the right moment was largely a story people told themselves to avoid acting on things they had already decided. She said he should go ahead and ask. He said he wanted to marry her. He said he wanted to build a life on the east side of the valley with her, and he wanted to raise horses and grow things in the hard desert soil. He wanted to sit on a porch with her when they were very old and argue about things that did not matter, and watch the sky go through its colors in the evening. He said he knew her father was not there to ask, but he thought Thomas Lockhart had been the kind of man who would have appreciated being spoken to honestly about it rather than formally petitioned. And so he was asking Maria directly, as he intended to always ask her things, directly and without performance, because she deserved a man who was honest with her from this moment forward. The stars were enormous above the old city. She said yes. She said it plainly and without performance, which was her style, but she was also smiling in that way that still surprised her, the smile that arrived without warning and felt larger than her face. He took her hand and held it and said nothing, and they stood in the cold Santa Fe street for a while, which was not a bad way to begin an engagement. They were married in April of 1883 in the spring, when the desert was doing its brief wild flowering and the air smelled of something almost sweet. It was a small wedding in the Redemption Creek Church, with Sheriff Dawson and his wife, old Mrs. Perez, Alice Bright, Mr. Briggs from the hardware store, and Harlan Cruz, the federal agent who had come down from Albuquerque specifically for the occasion, and who gave them a bottle of very good whiskey, and told Maria she had been the most composed witness he had ever dealt with in a case of this nature, which she accepted as the high compliment he intended it to be. Maria wore her mother's blue dress, which had been in the cedar chest since 1866, let out in the shoulders and taken in at the waist by Mrs. Perez, who was astonishingly skilled with a needle. She carried a small bunch of the desert wildflowers that were blooming along the creek. She had done her own hair in a long braid down her back, and when she walked down the aisle of the small church and saw Gilbert standing at the front in a dark coat he had clearly bought specifically for this occasion, looking at her with the full weight of his steady brown eyes. She thought she understood something about happiness that she had not understood before. It was not a condition, it was an action. It was something you chose repeatedly, with a specific person in a specific place, with your whole self. They exchanged vows in the simple language of the prayer book, and then they went outside into the brilliant April morning, and everyone hugged them, and Dawson's wife cried, and Mrs. Perez pressed Maria's face between both her hands and said something in Spanish that Maria understood well enough to make her own eyes sting. The reception was at the homestead, Maria's homestead, the one Thomas Lockhart had built, because that was where it felt right to be. They had strung lanterns from the fence posts, and Alice Bright played the fiddle, and people danced in the yard until the stars were well and truly out. And Maria danced with her husband in the light of the lanterns, and thought about the strange and difficult and ultimately beautiful way they had arrived at this moment. She told him about the morning she had stood at the door and seen the braid in Copper's mane, and how her whole resolution to stay angry had cracked open like hardpan in spring rain. He said he had braided it in the dark around 3 in the morning, having ridden out from town, having told himself the whole ride out that he was not going to do it, and then finding himself doing it anyway because some things were stronger than decisions. She said she was glad he had. He said he was too. The summer of 1883 was everything the previous summer had been, and differently so, richer and more complicated and better. Gilbert's house on the east 20 acres was finished by the end of May, a solid adobe structure with good windows, and the fireplace in the place they had argued about and which had turned out to be exactly right. They split their time between the two properties, which some people in town found eccentric but which suited them precisely, because Maria was not a woman who could easily give up the homestead, and Gilbert understood this and did not ask her to, and also because 2 properties could support twice as much in the way of cattle and horses as one, and they were practical people before they were sentimental ones. They acquired a dog in the summer, a large red hound of uncertain lineage who appeared at Gilbert's back door one morning and showed no inclination to leave. They named him Red, for obvious reasons, and he became a loyal and occasionally ridiculous fixture in their daily life, with a fondness for sleeping on Maria's feet and barking furiously at the mail carrier for reasons that were never explained. Maria expanded the horse operation. This had been a long-held ambition, and she finally had the help and the additional land to make it workable. She had always had a precise and intuitive understanding of horses, an ability to read their temperament and motion that she had inherited from her father, and she had been studying breeding lines in the agricultural papers for years. Gilbert had grown up working with horses and understood what she was trying to build, and so they planned it together over the kitchen table in the evenings, crossing lines in catalogs and arguing pleasantly about conformation. And by the end of 1883, the Lockhart Finley breeding operation was beginning to acquire a quiet reputation in the territory for producing horses of unusual quality. In the fall of 1883, Maria told Gilbert she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch of the homestead in the September evening, and she watched his face go through the same complex open transition she had seen when she told him she loved him. And then he pulled her close with great care, as if she had suddenly become precious in a new way that required recalibration. And she told him not to start treating her like something fragile or she would have words with him. And he laughed against her hair and said he would try to remember that. In the spring of 1884, their son was born. They named him Thomas Gilbert Finley, after her father and after his own, and he arrived on a clear March morning with the desert just beginning its brief spring color, and with Maria's customary efficiency and impatience with protracted processes. He was a healthy, loud, decisive baby who from the very beginning expressed strong opinions about everything from feeding schedules to sleeping arrangements, a trait which Gilbert observed was clearly an inherited characteristic. Maria told him to be careful what he implied by that, Thomas grew into a small person of considerable energy and curiosity. He had his father's brown eyes and his mother's absolute certainty about things, and by the time he was walking, he was already following both parents around the property with the focused attentiveness of someone taking notes. He particularly loved the horses, which surprised nobody who had met his parents. Alice Bright, who had become Maria's closest friend over the preceding years, married a rancher from the northern county in 1884 and began a family of her own, and the two women maintained a friendship conducted in long letters and occasional visits that was one of the steady pleasures of both their lives. Mrs. Perez remained their neighbor and their constant resource of practical wisdom and excellent cooking, and the kind of frank, affectionate opinion that Maria, who had grown up without her mother, had not known she was hungry for until it was available. Cord Darby was hanged in Santa Fe in the late spring of 1884. Maria received the notification in the mail, a brief official letter from the federal marshal's office, and she read it once and then put it in the cedar chest where her father's important papers had always been kept, and where, now, the letter from Darby's associate that had started everything also resided. She thought about that, the beginning and the end of the same story filed together in the box, and she thought it was probably exactly right. Gilbert had been in the barn when the mail came, and when he came in for the midday meal she handed him the letter and he read it standing at the kitchen door and then set it on the table and looked at her. She said simply that it was done. He said yes. They did not make a ceremony of it. They were not ceremonial people. But that evening after supper, after Thomas had been settled into sleep by his father with the particular efficiency that Gilbert brought to all nighttime parenting challenges, they sat on the porch of the homestead together in the May dark, and Maria was quiet for a long while looking at the stars. Then she said, "I am glad you came to Redemption Creek." He said he was too. She said she was glad he had fixed her fence, and her shed, and her stovepipe, and the approximately 40 other things he had repaired on her property over the course of the preceding 2 years. He said he had not been entirely strategic about it. He had genuinely found the work satisfying. She said she knew. That was what made it what it was. The years moved through the high desert with the quality of good years, which did not mean easy years but meant years in which the difficulties were manageable, and the pleasures were genuine, and the life being built was recognizably the life that had been intended. The breeding operation became, by 1886, a significant enterprise supplying quality horses to ranchers across 3 counties, and with a waiting list for certain bloodlines that gave Maria a deep, quiet satisfaction whenever she reviewed the ledger. Gilbert managed the financial end with the same precision and calm he brought to everything, and had an additional talent for negotiation that came from his years of complex dealings with difficult situations, and the combination of their skills produced an operation that ran well and grew steadily. In 1887, their second child arrived, another boy whom they named Samuel after no one in particular, but because it suited him from the moment they saw his face, which was considerably more placid than his brother's had been and remained so in the years to come. Samuel was a calm, affectionate child who liked to sit with the horses more than ride them, who showed from an early age an interest in plants and growing things that surprised his parents and delighted old Mrs. Perez, who began teaching him what she knew about the desert plants that could be used for food and medicine. Thomas at 3 had already developed a relationship with his father's horse that consisted largely of Thomas narrating everything the horse was doing in loud, enthusiastic commentary, while the horse endured this with considerable dignity. Gilbert watched this with visible amusement, and told Maria their son was going to be a horseman whether he intended it or not. Maria said she intended to let him choose his own path, and that she was simply going to ensure he had every possible option available. Gilbert said that was an excellent plan and also entirely characteristic of her. The homestead had expanded by this point. The eastern fence extended, a second paddock added, a proper breeding barn built with good light and ventilation that Maria had designed herself after reading extensively on the subject. The Finley land to the east had become the main residential property, with the homestead maintained as a working property primarily focused on the horses. They moved between the two easily, the mile of road between them as familiar as a room. Sheriff Dawson retired in 1887, and his deputy, a younger man named Cole Harris who had been born in the territory and knew its ways, took the position. Maria found she liked him well enough. A practical and unpretentious man who handled trouble with the minimum necessary force, and had a generally fair disposition toward the various communities in and around Redemption Creek, including the Hispanic families like the Perezes who were sometimes poorly treated by representatives of the law in other parts of the territory. Maria had thought a great deal about justice in the years since her father's murder and Darby's conviction, and she thought that what passed for law in the West was often a very rough approximation of the thing, shaped more by local politics and personal prejudice than by any principled standard. She said as much to Gilbert on several occasions, and he agreed, and they were both people who paid attention to how the institutions around them treated the most vulnerable members of their community, and who used their relatively established position to say plainly when they saw something wrong. This occasionally made them unpopular with certain segments of Redemption Creek's landowning class, who preferred that people of their standing maintain a comfortable silence about arrangements that benefited them. Maria found she could not locate within herself any desire to be popular with people whose principal characteristic was benefiting from other people's suffering, and Gilbert had never been a person who prioritized comfort over principle. It was one of the many things they agreed about entirely. In the spring of 1889, their daughter was born, their third child, arriving with the same March desert wildflowers that had welcomed Thomas 5 years before. They named her Eleanor Rosa Finley, Eleanor after Gilbert's mother and Rosa for the color of the desert in bloom, and she was from the beginning an entirely distinct person from her brothers, watchful and precise and quiet in the way that did not mean shy, but meant she was assessing everything before she chose to engage with it, which caused Gilbert to look at Maria with an expression of delighted recognition. Maria said she did not know what he was implying. He said he was not implying anything, he was simply observing. Eleanor Rosa Finley at 2 years old would sit in the barn and watch the horses with an intensity of focus that the horses themselves seemed to feel, and Maria watched her daughter and felt something move in her chest that was the particular feeling of seeing yourself in someone else. Not just the mannerism or the eye color, but the deeper thing, the way of meeting the world. By 1890, Redemption Creek had grown substantially. The railroad had come through the county in 1887, and with it, the particular acceleration of settlement and commerce that the railroad always brought. The town had a proper bank now, a second church, a hardware store that was twice the size of old Briggs's original establishment, a doctor who had trained at an Eastern college and who had the useful quality of actually knowing what he was doing, and a newspaper with a weekly edition that reached as far as Santa Fe. Maria read the newspaper and kept abreast of the territorial politics and the ongoing questions about statehood and the land disputes that were reshaping the territory's social geography, and she had opinions about all of it. She submitted 2 letters to the editor in 1889 and 3 in 1890, signed with her full name, Maria Lockhart Finley, on subjects including water rights law, the treatment of land claims by Hispanic families predating American territorial acquisition, and the management of public grazing lands. The letters generated responses, some favorable and some not, and she read all of them and responded in turn when she felt a response was warranted. Gilbert read her letters over her shoulder as she wrote them, and occasionally suggested a word or rephrased a sentence when he thought she could make her point more effectively. And she sometimes accepted his suggestion, and sometimes told him her phrasing was exactly right, and he was free to write his own letters, and he would smile and say he was, and that he preferred to read hers. He had his own quiet forms of engagement with the world. He served for 2 years on the County Board of Review for Land Disputes, a position he had been asked to take by the county commissioner, who had heard of his reputation for careful and fair judgment. He rode as a volunteer with the county sheriff's organization twice in situations that required numbers, and did so without any evident desire for recognition or drama. He was universally considered in Redemption Creek a man whose word was reliable and whose judgment was sound, and he wore this reputation the way he wore everything, without ornament and without apparent awareness that it was something worth noting. On a September evening in 1891, Maria and Gilbert sat on the porch of the homestead together, as they had sat together hundreds of times, watching the sky go through its colors in the last light. The children were inside, Thomas at 7 occupied with something loud, Samuel at 4 presumably engaged with his plants, Alina at 2 recently put to bed after a day of maximum investigation of everything within her reach. Red the hound was asleep at their feet, gray now around the muzzle, slower than he had been, still inclined to alarm at the mail carrier. Maria looked out at the desert in the evening light and said she wanted to tell him something. He said he was listening, in the way he had always listened, with the full quality of his attention. She said she wanted him to know that she was happy. Not in the way that people said it to fill silence, but as an actual fact that she had examined from all angles and found to be true. She had been thinking about it, she said, in the way she thought about things, carefully and with full attention to the evidence, and the evidence was that she was very happy and that she believed she would continue to be happy, and that she owed him a considerable portion of that. He was quiet for a moment. The desert deepened into purple, and the first stars appeared over the mountains. He said that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, including the fence work and the shed roof and approximately 40 other things he had repaired on her property, all of which he would do again without hesitation for the same outcome. She laughed. The surprised, genuine laugh. He smiled. She said, "You braided her mane so I would smile when I came outside." He said, "Yes," she said. "That was a very good decision," he said. "I thought so too." The desert was deep and dark and full of stars, and they sat together on the porch of the house Thomas Lockhart had built and watched the night come down over the valley, and the lanterns inside cast their warm light out through the windows onto the yard, and Copper was at the post as always, older now, his dark coat silver at the temples, his braided mane long since grown out, but the red cotton ribbons from that November morning 4 years ago still kept in the cedar chest with the important papers. Because some things were worth keeping. Because some things that began in the dark, in a quiet act of care that no one was watching, grew into the whole of a life. Because love, when it was the right kind, did not announce itself with drama or demand, but arrived early in the morning with careful hands and a willingness to be present for all of it. The fences and the grief and the federal courts and the Christmas dinners and the 3 children and the letters to the editor and the long porch evenings and the arguments about window placement and all the ordinary extraordinary days of a life built carefully and well. That was who Gilbert Finley was. That was who Maria Lockhart was. And that was what they had made together out of a complicated beginning and a hard desert country and the particular relentless grace of 2 people who had decided, against all reasonable expectation, to trust each other with everything. Thomas Lockhart had come west from Missouri in 1861 with $40 and a wagon and had built something that had outlasted him. His daughter had built something on top of it that went beyond what he could have imagined. Not just the homestead preserved, but the homestead alive, expanding, full of children and horses and argument and love, and the particular quality of the life that comes from choosing well and holding fast. and somewhere in the cedar chest in the bedroom of the house he had built, beside the deed to the eastern pasture, and the letter that had changed everything, and the 2 official documents from the federal court in Santa Fe, 3 strips of red cotton cloth lay folded in a small square, kept because Maria Lockhart was a practical woman who did not keep things without reason, and the reason was this. They were the beginning of everything that had come after, and she intended to know where the beginning was for the rest of her life. The stars came out over the valley, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, as they had come out over this land for 1,000 years before any of these people and their loves and their griefs and their careful choices had arrived under them. The desert breathed in the night. The children slept. The dogs slept. The horses stood at the fence in the dark. And on the porch of the house Thomas Lockhart had built, Maria Lockhart Finley leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and Gilbert Finley put his arm around her, and they watched the stars come out one by one until the sky was full of them. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said, or shown, or braided carefully into the dark mane of a horse in the early morning before the world was awake, for no reason and every reason. So that she would smile when she came outside,